Ah, my head hurts. I'll never drink again. Hi, hello, how's it going? It's Lo. We have celebrated yesterday the end of the spooky month, and I had grandiose plans of reading a ton of spooky books and just making like an hour-long wrap-up and just discussing all of the spooky things that I read. That did not happen. I am currently writing my thesis, my master's thesis. I am applying for a PhD. It's my end of my semester in university because, you know, when COVID struck, they suspended the classes, and now the classes came back virtually, and so I still have things I need to do for my classes. I'm still working full-time. The closer we get to the end of the year, the more hectic things get when you are an attorney in Brazil. And if you can tell that I look exhausted, it's because I am. I am very tired. But, you know, I did read some spooky things this month. Let's check. I have read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books this month, which is good considering how busy I was. I did a lot of audiobook reading, which was great. I started Pet Sematary, but I couldn't finish it in October, so that might go to my November TBR, but we'll talk more about that later. So let's begin with the first book of the spooky month. The first book that I read for the month of October was Full Throttle by Joe Hill. This is the Brazilian edition. As always, what the fuck? This edition is absolutely stunning. And it comes with a cover also. The cover also stunning. Like it's painted on the inside. Like the care that this editor puts into the books is just outstanding. It's incredible. This was a book that I received from my monthly subscription service in Brazil called Tag. And the thing about Tag is that I receive books that I don't know what they're about. So I didn't really have a really good idea about what this book was before I started reading, but it's just a collection of short stories, short horror stories by author Joe Hill, who is the son of Stephen King. Ugh. For the Brazilians who watch me, I will sum up my problems with this book in a single sentence in Portuguese. Esse livro foi traduzido parecendo filme de sessão da tarde. For those of you who don't understand Portuguese, a lot of American movies are dubbed in Brazilian Portuguese, and most times the dubbing is of terrible quality. It's a joke in and out of itself, and my problem with this book was the translation, because this is in Portuguese and the translation was simply horrid. So I'm not exactly sure how I would rate this book because of that. The translation was so bad that I'm not sure if I just liked the book because the translation was bad or if I just liked the book because Joe Hill isn't that good of an author. The stories weren't that scary when you start to think about them properly. Sometimes I couldn't understand what was happening. The thing is that this short story collection, you know, as always, short stories collections are always a hit or a miss. Not every single story will be good. I think there was one story here that I was like, okay, this is nice. But so far for the others, I really wasn't really very impressed with this, which again is a fucking pity because look at this. It's just so fucking stunning. Look at those pages and the drawings, and it's just so beautiful. Why couldn't you have been good? I'm just so upset about this book anyways. In the end, I gave Full Throttle 3 out of 5 stars. I decided to give it the benefit of the doubt because I didn't know if this was a problem of the translation or if this was a problem of the author, and I decided to go a little bit more cautiousness and give it a 3 out of 5 stars. So, the next book that I read for the month of October... The next book that I read for the month of October was House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. I wouldn't know how to pronounce his name without my phone. How can I explain House of Leaves? I don't even know where to begin. There's this guy called Johnny, and one day one of Johnny's best friends calls him and he's like, dude, like a guy died in my building and they're just kind of like taking all of his stuff because he has no family and friends. Do you want to come and take some stuff? And Johnny goes, and Johnny finds like this box with manuscripts, and the manuscript is a book called House of Leaves. And this book is not necessarily a narrative, and it's not necessarily, you know, it's not a novel. The book is not a novel. It's basically an academic book about this movie or this film that went around for some time called The Navidson Record. And The Navidson Record is a story about a family, or it's a documentary about a family who moves inside to a house. The family is the mother, the father, who was a famous photographer, and the two kids, and they move to this house, and then the father figures out that the house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, and when he makes that realization, a door appears to a corridor that has no end. And instead of leaving, what did? They go into the corridor. So, you know, like, I was kind of buddy reading it with my friend Sophia, and it was so funny because, like, there came a moment where I was like, dude, there isn't a single Latina person in this book to turn to those white people and go like, dude, get the fuck out of this house. The two of us were sitting and talking about this book, and we were like, if we went into our house one day and there was a door leading to a hallway, and that door had never been there and the hallway had no end, I would pack my shit and go. I would move back to my mother's house. I will set the house on fire. I would not go into the corridor. I have common sense. But this book is actually pretty interesting because it's a series of narratives upon narratives upon narratives. And there's a lot that gets lost, quote marks, in there, in the subtext of the book. You know, you are hearing the story of Johnny, who is going through this stuff of this dead guy called Zampano. And you're also hearing the story of Zampano himself as he tries to, because Zampano writes academically in a way, and because it's written academically, you are led to think, oh, this is impartial and whatnot. But it isn't, and there is no academic work that will ever be completely impartial. And, you know, pieces and bits of Zampano kind of appear through his academic narrative. There are parts of the book where there are footnotes of references, you know, see this and see that, and then you're going to check out, and some of those actually exist and some of those don't. So it's very unnerving in a way, and the book relies a lot on format. So I bought the ebook, but I had to end up getting the PDF because the ebook kind of like took away the formatting of the book that was incredibly important for the story structure. At the beginning of the book, I was terrified of it. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I've ever been that terrified of something in my life. I had to turn off my nightlight to go to bed. I couldn't sleep reading this book because, you know, the door opens, there's a hallway, instead of leaving, they go into the fucking hallway. But okay, there's this one scene specifically that just struck to me. I closed my computer and I was like, I am never going to fucking sleep in my life again. Zampano spends like 10 pages or something talking about echoes. So he's talking like the mythology of echoes, the history of echoes, and, you know, the physics behind echoes, and you're just reading that and just going like, okay, where the fuck is this going? And the last two paragraphs of that chapter are like a scene from the Navidson Record. And it's Daisy coming into the study, sitting on her father's lap and saying, I want to play. And her father says, oh, what do you want to play? And Daisy says, I want to play Always. And then the last paragraph of that chapter is Zampano saying, echoes can distort sound, because if you stop to think about it, always can also be heard as always. Oh no, just thinking about it gives me the heebie-jeebies. Oh my god, it's so... because you're not expecting that to hit you. Like, I read that and I got chills all over. I'd never experienced that. It was so surreal. I was like, dude, what the actual ever living fuck is going on in this house? But the thing is, after like the halfway mark, I kind of like understood what the house meant. And, you know, then from that point on, it wasn't more about being scared shitless about that. It was about kind of like piecing together the story. And I think, you know, the author understood that. And, you know, if you don't get what it is, I suppose it gets scary until the end. But in my case, I was just like invested in those characters, and I wanted to see how this representation of their distance of one another actually was resolved. and what would it take for it to be resolved. One thing I did not like about this book was Johnny, because Johnny is the first narrator that you meet. Towards the end of the book, I was just skipping like whole chunks of Johnny's footnotes because they became like increasingly impossible to understand. And I get that it's the point, but it comes to a point where you're like, okay, you made your, I got that. I get your point. Johnny is going cuckoo bananas. I get that. Okay, just like you made me read 3 pages worth of footnotes that make absolutely no fucking sense. So, you know, that was a really down for me. Also, the book didn't need to be that long, to be quite honest. But, you know, it was an interesting experience, and I don't think I've ever read anything quite like House of Leaves. And I will be going back to House of Leaves because I think it's the kind of book that you have to read more than once. And every time that you read more and you take your time with it, you can pick more details about it. So it's just amazing for me. It was a great experience. I gave House of Leaves 4 out of 5 stars. But it's definitely a book that I will be interested in buying physically so I can make notes. And it's also a book that I will be interested in rereading because I feel like when I reread, I will get much more information out of it. And I just love those types of books that you have to keep reading again and again to kind of understand and kind of like piece together more parts of the narrative. So yeah. The next book that I read for the month of October was Anthropophagic Manifesto by Brazilian poet Oswald de Andrade. This book is a leaflet, to be quite honest. It's very short. The Anthropophagic Manifesto was a sort of artistic movement that happened in the early 20s Brazil with modernism. Basically, Oswald de Andrade argues that Brazilian culture began when the first bishop was consumed by the first native. And from that moment on, whatever laid in the guts of that native was Brazilian culture. And, you know, it is undeniable that anthropophagy has a deep pervasive effect in Brazilian culture. Brazilian culture is notorious for doing this sort of consumption. We take external influences and, you know, the idea of anthropophagy actually was used in the 1920s as something of as resistance against colonialism and the influence of Europe, and then it was kind of like revived in the 1960s against American imperialism. The youth in the 1950s picking up electric guitars, singing in psychedelic themes like the Beatles, still being able to do like biting socio-critique at the time that baffled the censorship. So anthropophagy is a very interesting aspect of Brazilian culture. We do have this sort of ability to take everything that comes from outside and sort of like cannibalize what happens. And I'm not just talking about sushi pizza or whatever this monstrosity right here is. I'm just talking about like how we are able to take all of the external influences, and especially if they are forced upon us, and we take and we transform that into things that are inherently Brazilian. And it's just a huge aspect of Brazilian culture. So I read this book for college, but I enjoyed the hell out of it. Like, there are parts where he's like, to be or not to be. It's just so fucking genius. And anyways, Oswald de Andrade is great. The Anthropophagic Manifesto is great, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in the month of October was The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Lavalle. This book is the absolute shit. It is so fucking good. One of the best things that I read. It's just fucking, oh my god. So basically, The Ballad of Black Tom is a retelling of an H.P. Lovecraft story called The Horror at Red Hook. If you read the story, you know it's very fucking racist, and I have a lot of things to say about Lovecraft this video, so you know, just wait on. But basically, this story is the retelling of The Horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black man, and the twist that it gives, and the idea of following around a black man in early 1920s America is horrifying in and out of itself. So there is a layer of tension that accompanies the narrative because, you know, we are following a man whose very existence is a threat, quote marks, to other people. So he's constantly under attack. And we're constantly like, we're not afraid of the beings that are being invoked or whatnot. We are afraid because of the actual people. And I think that this book subverts it so well because it shows that what is really horrifying isn't Cthulhu or the old gods. What is really horrifying is the lengths upon which racism will ruin people's lives. It was just like such an incredible critique of Lovecraft. and, you know, doing like far better than Lovecraft ever could. I listened to this book on audiobook, and it was very good. I really liked the narrator. He did a great job and doing the voices and stuff, and the voice that he gave for Tom. But basically what I loved about this book, it was just like the biting critique of how white man will feel entitled to do anything that they want, and especially to ruin other people's lives without a second thought. So it was just a huge critique of, you know, racism and horror. The horror of Red Hook is, to put it kindly, boring, but this book actually really kept me on my edge, and I was like, okay, I really dig this shit. So yeah, I gave The Ballad of Black Tom 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in the month of October was Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs by Doughty. Doughty is one of my favorite authors of nonfiction in the whole world. Like, as we all know already by now, you know, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematorium is probably one of my favorite books of all times. I loved From Here to Eternity. I loved her podcast, Death in the Afternoon, which is really good, and if you haven't listened to it, it's really good. Her interviews, her YouTube videos, everything that she produces is just incredible. I placed a pre-order for the Brazilian edition of Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs because, as always, it's just fucking stunning. But I saw that it was available on Scribd, and Caitlin narrates it herself, and it's just amazing. So basically, Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs is just a collection of answers to questions that usually kids will ask about death. So, will my cat eat my eyeballs? Can I give grandma a Viking funeral? What happens to an astronaut if he dies in space? You know, things like that sound really simple to answer, but Caitlin has this thing that I really love. It's like, she doesn't treat any question as either too morbid or too stupid. She really is earnest answering the question. So like, will my cat eat my eyeballs? Yeah, he will. And your dog too, but this happens because of this and this and this and this and this. So she's very nice in her explanations. Caitlin Doughty just has the best voice to narrate things. I could hear her talk for like hours on end, and I actually did, listening to the audiobook, but it was just such a sweet moment, and it was just a sweet book, and it was just a sweet experience overall. And I think it's a good place to start talking to children about death. And it's so important to talk to children about death. As it is important to talk to children about everything. Like, children are adults in the making. They are, you know, adults who can be taught not to fear death from an early age and to understand it as a part of life. So this book is just amazing. If you have a kid in your life and, you know, their parents aren't going to kill you for it, give this to a child that is close to you, because they will love it. The book is gorgeous. It's just, in the end, as you can see from me gushing about this book, it was a very easy read, very simple read, very sweet read, and was a delightful time, and I just gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Next. We gotta talk about this big boy. The next book that I read in the month of October was this collection of short stories by H.P. Lovecraft. Ooh boy! First things first, let's start with the positives. Edition. Stunning, as you can see. It's just like absolutely fucking gorgeous. It's one of the most beautiful things that I have seen in my life. Like, it's legit amazing. Like, the drawings, the book, it's just like so fucking cool. The sprayed edges and stuff. It comes with manuscripts in the end also, which, you know, are just... Y'all thought this was what I thought too? Let me know in the comments. But this is a collection of stories from different parts of Lovecraft's life. We have very important short stories here. Not the Horror of Red Hook. I read this before. But we have Dagon, we have The Nameless City, we have Reanimator, we have The Hound, we have The Call of Cthulhu, In the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow from the Time, something like that, and The Statement of Randolph Carter. I am translating this right off my head, and my head is just not really working because I am very hungover. So, where do I begin? Again, this is a short story collection. Not every short story in the short story collection will hit the mark. There was one short story I thought was really creepy, that was Dagon. And I really liked Shadow from Time, something like that. I think that's the name of the story. I fucking hated In the Mountains of Madness. It was awful. It was a torture reading this short story. It was fucking ridiculous. The Hound was okay. Call of Cthulhu, boring. So I really want to talk about this. I have so many things I want to talk about Lovecraft. The first thing is, Lovecraft is extremely repetitive. So his stories have sort of a system, you know? It's always something like explorers and people who do things that, you know, they think themselves at the cutting edge of knowledge and whatnot. And then they run across something that is far older, far more ancient, and far more powerful than they are. They narrowly escape, and then they live to tell the tale and warn other people of that. Every single story basically works like that. It's just, you know, and this is a problem in a short story collection because by the fourth you're like, dude, can you think of something else? Like, what the fuck? Also, like, he has absolutely no idea how to measure exposition. So you have paragraphs upon paragraphs upon paragraphs of expositions that are wholly irrelevant to the plot of the short story. And you know, Lovecraft, it's truly a white American rich male because he really likes to hear himself talk. It's just unnerving. Also, another thing, not a single female character in this book. Look how thick this big boy is. Not a single female character in this book. So, you know, dope. Racism. Holy fucking racism, Batman. Like, whoa, I knew Lovecraft was racist, but holy shit was I surprised by how racist Lovecraft was in this book. This was just insane. It was insane levels of racism in here. I think that really feeds into my perception of Lovecraft when I think that Lovecraft wrote stories that were horrifying to him because there were stories about this white American rich male who is at the top of society, who is, you know, the world caters to his every need, comes across something that does not give a shit about him, and also is just like far more intelligent than what he is. And you know, people usually read those stories as a fear of the unknown and, you know, as a reaction to an influx of immigrants that the United States was receiving at the time. And yeah, that is correct, but I think it also speaks a lot about Lovecraft's fear in white supremacy, in the sense that he was so scared that he wouldn't be in the top of the chain anymore. And I think that in this story he kind of tells on himself, like, what scares you isn't the unknown, the universe, and what scares you is like fucking people of color being better than what you are, like being forced to face your own mediocrity, being faced with the fact that you only have what you have because you are what you are. And it's particularly interesting because the characters are always doing some exploration and they have the gall to be like shocked when it goes wrong, like fucking robbing graves. There are 3 stories in this book of people robbing graves and I'm like, dude, what the fuck did you expect would happen? I'm robbing these graves for science. Yeah, congratulations on being fucking haunted, bitch. It's always this feeling that there's this man who believed that the world was his for the taking, comes across the fact that not only the world is not only his for the taking, but he is utterly unimportant for the great scheme of things. Doesn't matter how important he thinks he is, doesn't matter how smart he thinks he is, and you know, he uses that sentence about his for many times, like, all of those of superior intellect, which, you know, it is very interesting that this is what this man believes, that it's scary. And as he publishes this, other white men read this and turn this into a landmark of horror. And yeah, of course, Cthulhu is scary as shit. You know, if you put something that looks like Cthulhu in front of me, I'd be like, yeah, that shit is scary. But it is very interesting to see like how I read this book, and I'm not scared about this at all because my entire life I have been told that I am significant, that I won't amount to much, and you know, that I will need to acknowledge that there are people who are far better than I am. So this is not scary, this is not news, this is not just like whatever. It is interesting that we have like an author who is just like writing horror stories about his realization of his own unimportance. And I think like when we're reading critically and when we are being critical people, we have to contend with this, because I don't believe in censorship and I don't think like, oh, you shouldn't read this because it's bad and we're not. it's impossible to talk about horror and not talk about Lovecraft, as it's impossible to talk about horror and not talk about Stephen King. So, like, how do we address this? How do we address this legacy of bigotry in horror? I don't believe in censorship. I don't think that we shouldn't read things just because, you know, they were bigoted, and I think there are two solutions, and one is one that Brazilian publishing does all the time, and I'm gonna see if I can find. So this is something that Brazilian publishing does, and Brazilian publishing does this even with children's books. We have a children's author called Monteiro Lobato who is very controversial because he wrote in the same time period and he was very racist. So what Brazilian publishing does is that they put a side note, or a footnote in publishing, explaining, you know, addressing and pointing out, like, this is very fucking racist. And in this case, this is a book aimed for adults, and they're like, okay, see this, see this, see this, for the discussion of racism in Lovecraft. Of course, you know, like, pointing out that it is very fucking racist, and you should not overlook it. And of course, when you're talking about children, you kind of like adjust your tone a bit. But this is something that I think it's interesting because it kind of like calls the reader to go, oh yeah, I should read this critically because, you know, it's like not good, not good. But on the other hand, I think The Ballad of Black Tom is a great example of what we should do to kind of like subvert those horror tropes, subvert those horror stories, to be able to tell stories that frame, again, like Mexican Gothic did, frame exploitation, racism, and bigotry as abjection, as horrifying, so we can take horror back. And it's a place of endless possibilities, you know. The genius of Get Out, for example, the genius of Us, is that it really reframes what is terrifying. I've talked too much, but I've given this bad boy over here a 2.5 out of 5 stars. I did not have a good time. The majority of these points come from 2 short stories that I read that were fun, and also the edition being absolutely gorgeous. But other than that, it just really wasn't a good time, and I don't think I will be picking any more Lovecraft in the future unless I really have to. Finally, the last book that I read in the month of October was The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
This book fucking murdered me. I don't think I've ever had such a visceral reaction to a book like this before. I finished The Only Good Indians and it just felt like my chest was caving in. I doubled in half and I just screamed into my pillow because of grief. And it's just like, it was such a visceral reaction that I had to this book. It was just like, holy fucking shit. Whoa. So basically in The Only Good Indians, you are following 4 boys from the tribe Blackfeet. They were living in reservations. One day they go on a hunt and they end up killing an elk, and they are forced to waste the majority of it. You know, 10 years later, the elk is back and she wants to fuck them up. So basically that's the premise of the story. The premise in itself, it's already very scary. Stephen Graham Jones' writing, what in the actual ever-living fuck? It's one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen in my entire life. I will admit that the beginning of the book was a bit slow for me. It took me a while to really get into, but it's like 20% of the book in. When I finally figured out what happened to the elk, it was like a runaway train and things just went going sideways. It's just like, things just kept looking very bad. And it's just like a commentary on a heritage that puts you into a position of so much trauma and so much difficulty, and they talk about all the time in life in the reservations. And you know, I had to educate myself a lot on life in the reservations in the United States where this book is set, because I'm very familiar with Native and indigenous people reservations in Brazil and in Latin America, because you know, it's where I live. But I wasn't really familiar with the context of reservations in the US. And it was a really interesting and educating experience to be able to go and educate myself on that, and then go back to the book and understand that this is a book that talks profoundly about heritage, about a heritage that brings you so much grief, but at the same time you love it so much, it's like in your bones and you can't let go, of being chased by that. And it's like, it's not only because you left the reservation, it's because you're like going away from this heritage because it brings you so much pain, and like how the cycle of grief and pain will continue and perpetuate themselves because these people are forced to be at war with what was rightfully theirs, which was the land. The resolution of that, how things actually wrap up, how this is a way of like, of how you need to embrace that what hurts you. It's just fucking beautiful. It was one of the most beautiful things that I've read this year. I was in tears when I was reading The Only Good Indians. It like broke me. It destroyed me. It was so good. It was so frightening. Like, there are certain things that you could, like, I was tense the whole time. It was so difficult, but at the same time it was so beautiful. I am like stunned by this book. This book's absolutely gorgeous. And, you know, if you couldn't tell, I give The Only Good Indians a 5 out of 5 stars. It was a great way to close Halloween month. Anyways, this was my October wrap-up. If you read any of those, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear what you have to say about it. I had a blast. I really read some really good books this month, and more than ever, I'm convinced that horror is definitely a place where we need to put our hands into it and try to make it tell the stories that we wanted to be told. Fuck Lovecraft. Fuck Lovecraft. That is my parting message. But yeah, this was my October wrap-up. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time.